Today's material is about distinctiveness. There are two types of distinctiveness with different effects on the timing and scope of protection. One type is inherent distinctiveness, which is assessed on the axis of conceptual strength. A symbol is only eligible for inherent distinctiveness if it automatically functions as a trademark when properly used as a trademark. With acquired distinctiveness, the relevant axis is marketplace strength. A symbol is eligible for acquired distinctiveness if it is capable of distinguishing goods or services, whether or not it is inherently distinctive. In analyzing a trademark problem, you should always ask about both conceptual, also known as inherent distinctiveness, or strength, and acquired or marketplace distinctiveness or strength. Courts will rely more on one or another depending on the situation and on their preferred outcomes. We begin with Abercrombie and Fitch versus Hunting World from the Second Circuit. This is extremely influential. It is used by all the circuits. Abercrombie has a long history of suing other clothing sellers for trademark infringement and mostly of losing. You don't get the facts in the casebook excerpt, but what happened was that Abercrombie had a registered trademark on Safari for clothes and shoes, and a competitor began to use Safari or Mini Safari or Safari Land on its own clothes. So we get this set of categories. Category 1 isn't a category of marks because generic terms can't be marks, but sometimes courts talk loosely about this. A generic term is one that refers or has come to be understood as referring to the genus of which the particular product is a species. The court points out that the lines of demarcation are not always bright. Moreover, a term can be descriptive or generic as applied to one product and arbitrary as applied to another, like the word apple. This is the best arbitrary name I've ever seen, noodles, 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 for furniture. The Abercrombie court also says that a term can be arbitrary at one time and generic at another, like escalator or aspirin. If genericity can change over time, Nabisco's argument about shredded wheat has at least some potential validity. That is, it might have started out generic, but over time became associated with a single producer. However, you might at least have to invent and teach a separate generic term before that could happen. Both highly descriptive marks and fanciful marks like aspirin might be at particular risk of being understood as simply the name of the underlying thing and thus generic, which is why another version of the spectrum is to show it in a circle. As an illustration of line drawing difficulties, the Abercrombie court says that ivory is arbitrary for soap, but there's actually a good argument that it's suggestive. They did pick ivory and not ebony or bone for the name. The line between arbitrary and suggestive, though, is not as important as the other lines because both arbitrary and suggestive marks are considered inherently distinctive and immediately registrable. Abercrombie also gives us the role of the Lanham Act. Section 2E prohibits the registration of merely descriptive marks, but 2F takes it almost all back. Descriptive marks can be registered if they've become distinctive of the applicant's goods in commerce. The PTO can accept that the mark has become distinctive on proof of substantially exclusive and continuous use for 5 years, and proof here is used rather loosely. We're often just relying on the applicant's word. So how do you draw the line between suggestive and descriptive terms? A term is suggestive if it requires imagination, thought, and perception to reach a conclusion as to the nature of the goods. A term is descriptive if it forthwith conveys an immediate idea of the ingredients, qualities, or characteristics of the goods. So we have this significant line between suggestive and descriptive terms. A suggestive term is treated as inherently distinctive and protected immediately upon use as a mark, while a descriptive term is only protected if it acquires secondary meaning over time. Now, instead of having the Abercrombie system, we could do with words what we do with color and product design. We could require all word marks to show secondary meaning before they can be protected, but we don't, and I'm going to offer some reasons why. First is probabilities. The theory is that people are likely to recognize arbitrary or suggestive words and symbols as marks immediately, even on first exposure. And so requiring a case-by-case determination might be very expensive and also more error-prone than a general rule because of the accidents of proof. So immediate recognition of arbitrary or suggestive terms as marks is the shakiest rationale empirically. It turns out that if you present a term in the place that consumers expect a trademark to be, they usually immediately perceive it as a trademark, no matter what the classification is, except with a generic term like fudge-covered cookies. But in fact, in a test of this proposition, the terms that respondents identified as trademarks 100% of the time on this slide were celebrate, which the authors of the study called descriptive, and choriren, fanciful. They were at 75% with wonderful, which is descriptive, and map, which is fairly arbitrary. Second, maybe a more compelling rationale for giving rights immediately to a certain class of words and symbols is the lack of a public interest in freedom of access. If a term isn't strongly related to a particular good or service, then allowing a private company to appropriate it easily doesn't cause much public burden. So MAP is not a good name, but it's also not a name that we need to preserve for cookies. And as Learned Hand says, the ingenuity of the public relations profession supplies new words and slogans as they are needed. Third, there's predictability, a producer-oriented justification. It's a bad idea for companies to have to wait to find out if their alleged marks will actually be protectable. Having a category of immediately protected marks makes it possible for the mark owner to be certain early on and also encourages them to choose such marks, leaving descriptive terms free for everyone to use. This rationale can definitely justify the category of inherently distinctive marks. It doesn't actually justify putting suggestive marks on the inherently distinctive side of the line, which I think is a mistake, but which is very much the law. So after that introduction, I want to give some introductory notes on secondary meaning. And the classic case here we have is the American Waltham watch case. The defendant's watches are on the right. American Waltham watches are on the left. So Waltham is a geographic term. Therefore, it begins life as descriptive and stays that way, but has secondary meaning due to the plaintiff's efforts at developing goodwill. The court therefore bans the defendant from advertising its watches as Waltham watches and from marking its watches Waltham conspicuously without some distinguishing statement. So defendants can't use Waltham freely, even though it might be true to say that the watches are from Waltham, and even though the place of manufacture is important to purchasers. The key point here is that when a plaintiff has trademark rights in a descriptive term, it can often limit competitors' use of that term. There are connections here to Kellogg as well. The plaintiff can exclude a defendant from a part of the free field of the English language, even from the mere use of generic words, unqualified and unexplained, when they would mislead the plaintiff's customers to another shop. The remedy granted is not actually very different from the requirement imposed on Kellogg, where the term was generic. But in the Waltham case is understood today, unlike Kellogg, to be about de jure secondary meaning. That is, Waltham Watch has some rights to exclude others from using the term. As occurred with personal names, we become less solicitous of the second comer's right to tell the truth about where the goods are produced, where the truth would be misleading to some number of consumers. So I also want to bookend with a modern case, the Chrysler versus Moda imported from Detroit case. If the term is suggestive, then Chrysler is almost certain to win its infringement claim. And the question then is, does the clever use of imported constitute enough surprisingness to make the phrase suggestive? Another way to say it is there a competitive need for people to be able to say imported from places like Detroit? Intentional copying doesn't seem to be as relevant to the court in its secondary meaning analysis as it was in Smack Apparel, and we can consider in class why that might be. What we do learn is that spending money, even on a Super Bowl ad, isn't enough. Advertising is an imperfect proxy at best for secondary meaning. That might not seem super persuasive here, but consider this. Do you remember Vault soda? Coca-Cola spent millions and millions and millions of dollars advertising it and advertising slogans for it like the taste, the quench, the kick, or chug and charge. But Vault was nonetheless discontinued in 2011 after 6 years on the market. So actually, consumers do have a choice about whether secondary meaning is generated. Courts are often quite generous in finding secondary meaning in modern cases when you have something that develops a little more slowly than one day. And then finally, I will show you an interesting example of the relevance of use by others or unsolicited media coverage. Here is a case where the TTAB used the existence of parodies as evidence of acquired distinctiveness for the mark serial in stylized form for a podcast. And that's probably pretty important, since serial in stylized form edges close to generic for a podcast. So you're going to want pretty good evidence. And this is the kind of evidence that does show that people expect serial in that form to come from a particular source. So that's it, and I'll see you in class.